If I told you that this guy was a fashion genius, you would probably laugh in my face. But Paul McCartney is one of the best dressed men in history, but not for the reason you might think. And in this video, I'm going to go over the development of his fashion mastery throughout the years. So Paul McCartney's life and professional career obviously began in Liverpool, but it really became honed in Hamburg, Germany. And it's there that we get the first incarnation of Paul McCartney as a greaser, strangely enough. The greaser years for the Beatles are kind of strange in hindsight because kind of what they represented to the general public was the end of that 50s rockabilly era. However, they were very evidently inspired by it, which you can see in this clothing choices. Elvis was obviously Paul McCartney and John Lennon's biggest single influence for becoming musicians, and you can see just that 50s rock and roll style being heavily influential on these young men. And because of that, in these early days, you had the Beatles wearing a lot of like blue jeans, leather jackets, t-shirts, the slick back hair, you know, kind of background extras on Grease, that kind of look. This is not a bad look for the group, and considering the type of places that they were playing, which is almost like strip club adjacent in Hamburg, it kind of fit the image because they were truly rebels at this point in time and they looked the part. And it's just kind of interesting to think about like the what if they had like chosen to continue down this path with that greaser look. They actually ditched the slick back hair before they ditched the blue jeans and t-shirts, as you can see in these kind of early photos where they've got the Beatles look starting to pop through, but it's definitely just not there yet. That would of course require the input of their manager, Brian Epstein. So this is the original Beatles suit. As you can see, it's a collarless suit, which is why it doesn't quite look right to my eyes. So I have to be completely honest with you. This classic Beatles suit that was created in part with some input from McCartney to the tailor just kind of looks weird. Like you can see it in this photo where it's like the collar is just poking up. It looks like he's wearing a smock. Like there's a reason why they didn't keep doing it. It's because it just doesn't look right. I also have to say it's kind of like the Beatles are wearing a Halloween costume of themselves. Something which is even more surreal in this photo. Look, I don't hate it, but I certainly don't love it. Let's just move on. By the time that they got around to playing the Ed Sullivan Show, they had already ditched those original Beatles suits in favor of the more tailored classic menswear that they would wear on that program. This early Beatles era of suits is very homogenizing in the way that like it made the group look professional. It made them both simultaneously rebellious with the new hair, but also safe for the parents. With these business suits, it was a lot of just plain or checkered shirts, but you can also tell that he was able to put a lot of like the English sophistication into these outfits that, you know, kind of brought them over the top. And also because these were just very well put together suits, it also made Paul the cute one. However, even in this most conservative of times, Paul McCartney wore quite a few costumes. You got Spaceman Paul, you got Sheriff Paul, you got Pussycat Paul. And as you likely know, Paul McCartney's hair and outfits got more experimental as the 60s went on. And by 1966, when Revolver came out, I really feel like that this is just their true peak period of looking like rock stars. Those sunglasses on Revolver, they just look like the most famous anybody's ever been. And while they still were wearing on the surface traditional menswear, you can see in this photo right here, this is pretty typical of the period, that Paul's got on this like canary yellow blazer with this striped shirt on. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, we're going to be wearing the business wear as requested, but it's going to be the most absurdly over the top, like extravagant and flashy version of that. He's got that like, you know, don't check the bank account preacher kind of look going on here, you know what I mean? Something you can also see at their last gig at Candlestick Park where they've got just the business suits, but with like their shirts being the psychedelia just begging to burst out. And burst out it did, of course, with the famous Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was, of course, mostly Paul's idea of pushing forward this like alternative band that could stand in for the Beatles and go on tour for them. And for this, he created this kind of personas for the group. And you can see that in these outfits that he helped create for that album, where they all grew their mustaches out and they're wearing these like pseudo-Victorian military uniforms. I listened to a The Rest is History episode that was going over the Beatles, saying that a large amount of their appeal comes from the fact that the British Empire was in decline, which is a weird thing to think about, but it is true that like this kind of satire of British, you know, military imperialism kind of only works whenever the British are not, currently imperializing your country. But of course, Sgt. Pepper's wasn't the only thing that they did. This era was, of course, just featuring a lot more just experimental, flowery outfits from Paul and the others. However, this bright and flashy period was followed by Paul really kind of toning it back with his outfits. You can see that if you watch Get Back, where Paul is usually wearing these kind of like modified business suits a lot of the time. And you can also see that workhorse mentality that Paul had in the last photo shoot that the group ever did together, where Paul had multiple outfits for the different areas of the shoot, whereas the rest of the Beatles were like, this is how I'm coming, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And while the breakup of the Beatles that followed this period was tragic, it also probably invited in the best era of fashion for each one of the Beatles individually. I swear it's like after the weight of the Beatles was off their shoulders, they all decided to become fashionistas. And you can see that in these great photos that you have of Paul in the rustic Scottish Highlands with Linda. He's wearing a lot of these just very classic sweaters and like thick coats. And it just truly looks like these photos could have been taken yesterday because they're just that classic looking. Like seriously, this is just the model from the Abercrombie and Finch collection that showed up in the mail. This is also just a very relaxed period with Paul going around shoeless or just with like a baby in his shirt. And this cool rustic aesthetic that he was having with Linda is just the actual couple goals. However, what is possibly his best era was followed by what is possibly his single worst. Yeah, we're moving from the oh my god, why we stopped dressing like the 70s into the like, oh yeah, I remember why. It's just these like really gaudy sweater vests, like so many sweaters, like all of them terrible, or these striped shirts with these big collars that like don't fit, or leisure suits that Elvis rejected. I don't know what he was going for in this period. This is also the period of the McMullet, like oh my God, you should have been put on a list for that. And it was such a bad influence. He made Linda do it too. Like, what'd you go into the barber shop and say, F my S up? Except for you said the real words? God. This one casual photo of him in the Grateful Dead t-shirt does just look good. I do like the wide lapels. Once again, I don't know why he was going about choosing the worst versions of it, but he still knew what he was doing even in his lowest moment. Let's just move on, okay? Let's go to the 80s. So by the time that the 80s rolled around, he had stopped with as much of like the war crime outfits and kind of settled into much more of a like mature, kind of middle-aged look. It was much more of just a mature, clean look that was almost preppy at times. You can see that on this photo. And there was also some more restrained version of the baggy suits that were popular during the 80s. A lot of these 80s suits, like this one right here, you could almost call like Miami Vice Corps. And the one that we've got presented right here is just very excellent. I know that the t-shirt under the actual full suit can be a little bit, grating at times if it's not done well. The way that Paul's put it together here does just look excellent. Like, it's how I wish that I looked in a suit. This performance that he did with Tina Turner is a pretty good example of like those baggy suits that he was wearing during this period, where it's this off-color blazer from like this white outfit, and it's very baggy, which can look good. This isn't terrible, but it is very dated, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you know that this came from the 80s when you look at it. That is, of course, whenever he wasn't getting the literal Moe haircut from the Three Stooges. That was a classic joke back in the day of like, oh, all the Beatles were just wearing the Moe haircut. Well, he actually got that, and it's still better than whatever happened here. Dear God. But for the most part, Paul avoided a lot of the issues that could have, stumbled a middle-aged pop star during that period. He certainly was not the worst. By the time that the 90s rolled around though, Paul was definitely in his elder statesman of rock period, and it very much behooved him. He was wearing a lot more of earthier tones, which kind of both reflected his vegetarian lifestyle and animal activism. He was into wearing a lot of just these very like colorful like vests during this period. I'm not sure what was going on there. It was kind of the early 90s though. There was just a lot of this kind of color palette going on. And I do have to say I do like this much more than the duller kind of 80s stuff that he had been doing for those years prior. Bro got that global coffee house palette. Bro got that Zoo Books Pinterest board palette. And as the 90s wore on, you could see that Paul was getting like safer and safer with his outfits, which I mean, he's getting a middle-aged man at this point. Like, it makes sense. With that McCartney intuition, he could tell things kind of needed to change By the late 90s, you can tell that things really needed to change. Like, there were some of these later appearances in the 90s where it looked like Paul had one too many Monkberry Moon delights, if you know what I'm saying. And you can see this turned around in the 2000s, where I believe that Paul must have just gotten a hold of a stylist. He was like, I do have $1 billion, I can't actually just do that now. And you can see that reflected with these excellent outfits that he's been putting together ever since the early aughts. We stopped doing the fully dyed hair and gone for this like salt and pepper look that's like long but not too long, which just looks excellent. I saw him a couple years ago live, and he does just look like he's got another 80 years in him. He really is just that good. So, and part of the reason why he does still look so like vital is with these like very tailored, I guess you would call them 80-year-old billionaire grandpa rock star suits. I don't know what these are. They're in this perfect like platonic middle between like business suit and like stage wear that they just very much look good for Paul McCartney where he's at in his current stage in life. It would also be remiss for me not to mention that throughout his entire career, as we can see here, Paul has used his fashion specifically for like specific political and world causes, which is something that's important to mention, that these outfits were a lot of the times very much the message that he was trying to get across at that point. But the appreciation of these outfits is useless without the historical information to understand the context in which they were presented, which you can learn a little bit more about in this video.